here. This is something that we have on the first Tuesday in every month. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're on Whadjuk land here at the University of Western Australia, and pay our respects to the elders and traditional owners of this land. And I can see that we've got people online, which is great. So this seminar is looking at the topic of workplace sexual harassment, and it's a piece of work with Circle Green. So we have Dr. Leanne Lester, who's the research manager here at the Centre for Social Impact, alongside Heidi Bilbach and Madeline Brown from Circle Green. So it's a great collaboration and a very important topic, workplace sexual harassment, looking at trends in workplace sexual harassment, what we know and what we don't know, which is a very important area, and what are some recommendations coming out of it. So I'll hand over to you. No? You're going to start, Leanne?
I think Madeline's ready to talk about the project.
Yeah,
Right.
of course. I'll give some context around the project and our work at Circle Green, and then hand over to Ian to get into the report. So, a little bit about Circle Green. We're a community legal centre, and we received funding under recommendation 53 of the Respect at Work report, which you might have heard about. It's a report published by the Australian Human Rights Commission a few years ago, and one of the recommendations, number 53 to be exact, was this one on the screen. So essentially that there be funding provided to community legal centres and other bodies to provide legal advice and assistance to assist vulnerable people who have been targeted by workplace sexual harassment. And in WA, Circle Green Community Legal is the lead agency for that funding. So in 2021, as you can see on the screen, over $5 million was allocated to WA, and this is spread over a 4-year period. And this funding is for the provision of legal assistance services to people who've experienced workplace sexual harassment or discrimination. And as part of that project, we are doing a range of things, and I'll hand over to Heidi, I believe, to talk you through what that looks like.
Thanks. Yeah, so just quickly, because Leanne is the star of the show, I just want to, I guess, contextualize the main activities we do. So we are Circle Green is a community legal centre more broadly. We have 3 streams: humanitarian, tenancy, and workplace. So we already provide legal assistance on a general level and within the workplace stream. So in terms of the these 4 buckets here, the delivering legal services bucket is really a scaling activity to be able to, so we provide information and referral, we provide legal advice, and with this funding we're able to also extend and provide casework as well. Tracking legal need is really like the subject matter of this webinar, so I'll leave that for Leanne to go into. And then in terms of facilitating capacity building, that's really around community legal education and professional development with communities and professionals, and specifically in the domain of workplace sexual harassment, and workshops as well as resources. And then we also do long form advocacy, particularly in relation to the Respect at Work implementation and associated issues with that. And then kind of underpinning all of that, we have a lived experience advisory panel who advise on service delivery and content development to inform the work that we do and make sure that we've got that lived experience voice embedded in our work. So I'll hand over to Leanne for the research part.
Thank you, Leanne. So firstly, I'm presenting on behalf of Paul, Yaz, Sarah, Bryn and Ruben. Our review gathered findings from the WA Government, Australian Human Rights Commission, Equal Opportunity Commission and published reports and papers. We also conducted interviews and surveys with stakeholder organisations to better understand workplace sexual harassment. Finally, and most importantly, I want to thank the people with lived experience who entrusted us with their experience, which informed the recommendations. So what is workplace sexual harassment? The Sex Discrimination Act of 1984 defines it as unwelcome sexual advance, unwelcome requests for sexual favours, unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature in circumstances in which a reasonable person would be offended, humiliated or intimidated. Workplace sexual harassment is subjective and contextual, with inconsistent legal definitions in different pieces of legislation, making it difficult to define. Failure to clearly define sexual harassment represents a missed opportunity to remove ambiguity and confusion about the specific workplace safety risks it poses. So in the latest Equal Opportunity Commission survey, 1 in 5 people have been sexually harassed at work, and only 41% reported that they're aware, 41% could get the services that they needed. So what were the most common types of workplace sexual harassment experienced? Sexually aggressive, sexually suggestive comments, intrusive questions, inappropriate staring, unwelcome or inappropriate physical contact, and most commonly occurring at workstations or within social areas. Workplace sexual harassment is a workplace health hazard. People who are targeted by workplace sexual harassment experience trauma and other psychological harm, physical and social impacts, and reduced quality of life. The financial cost of workplace sexual harassment is also incredibly high, contributing to a colossal loss of resources and revenue within Australia. So why is it still occurring? Many workplace cultures normalise workplace sexual harassment. Workplace culture change is needed to address covert and overt incidences of workplace sexual harassment. Sexual harassment complaints lodged with the Equal Opportunity Commission ranked highest in the number of complaints. However, we know it is grossly underreported. As seen earlier, an estimated 17% of people who experience workplace sexual harassment actually report it. So why isn't it being reported? Well, simply, it's not easy, and reporting can perpetrate psychological harm. There's personal fears, and also systemically, different pieces of legislation make it difficult for workers or employers to navigate. Our lived experience panel talked about barriers to reporting. These barriers were around concern of their reputation, feeling misunderstood. The actual harassment itself impacted their self-esteem and mental health. They felt judgment. They experienced loss of employment and workplace backlash. There was also downplaying of experiences by others around them and also by themselves. They also have a distrust and fear in reporting. As one lady said, it leaves fundamentally a trauma, and that trauma is long-lasting and it's complex. So what did work? Reporting workplace sexual behaviour to management and HR didn't work. It was a negative experience for all women, with many describing the experience as re-traumatising. So seeking external support, obtaining mental health support, warm referrals to different agencies, and being educated as to the different processes available to them was seen to be the most helpful. What didn't work was internal reporting, having to continually work with the perpetrator, victim blaming, further harm and trauma, and having to repeat their story many, many times, and non-disclosure agreements. We also surveyed and talked to organisations who provided legal advice. Of these organisations, 76% of their clients were female, but they were very complex clients. 16% did not have English as their first language, 13% had a disability or mental illness, 3% were also experiencing family and domestic violence, and 3% required translating and interpreting services. The interviews with organisations suggest many barriers are experienced across all regions of WA, but several barriers are exclusive to rural areas. These included a perceived lack of privacy and confidentiality, isolation, and workplace culture which normalises workplace sexual harassment. In regional areas, a single company is more likely to monopolise an industry, and people face more risk by acting against workplace sexual harassment. And anecdotally, regional and rural workplaces are more likely to tolerate a culture of acceptance of workplace sexual harassment. Challenging the tolerance culture may be more difficult due to the lack of resources or biased leadership within smaller organisations in regional areas. The following recommendations are from evidence that we gathered. So in terms of workplaces and employees, changing workplace culture, educating employees, especially management, updating policies and guidelines, making them clear, making regular compulsory training, data collection and tracking around workplace sexual harassment, rejection of use of the non-disclosure agreements, and strong sanctions imposed on employers and employees who perpetrate harm or do not appropriately respond to workplace sexual harassment. In terms of legal centres providing legal assistance, focus needs to turn to identifying how to best respond and avoid further harm. This includes recognising the barriers to seeking support and understanding what currently works. So strategies could include adopting a trauma-informed approach, integrating lived experience voices, communication and clarity, addressing issues beyond legal needs, education of workplace sexual harassment, as legal assistance services are well positioned to minimise the gap in access to justice. Recommendations for systems and legal reform. Current legal and regulatory systems are no longer fit for purpose. The system needs to protect the victims by ensuring all involved are educated and trauma-informed. Reform could include review of payment of legal costs, removal of compensation caps, increasing formal reporting time limits and criminal cases to be judged only. So concluding thoughts, reporting alone does not address the cause or ongoing impact of workplace sexual harassment. We need consistency in legislation. Victims need to feel safe and be informed and to be encouraged to seek support outside their employment. Legal assistance services must offer effective, informative and responsive care. Barriers such as short limitation periods, poor workplace culture, the mental health impacts of workplace sexual harassment and fear of retaliation or judgment are further exacerbated by people living in rural and remote areas. A review of social and systemic barriers to offer effective, responsive and person-centred support is required. Now, I've gone quickly through the research. You can find both the summary report and the full report online at our website and Circle Green's website if you need more information. And I think, Heidi, you're going to come and talk about what happens next.
Sure. Do you want to start this one or not?
We can both come.
Yeah, let's go with it. Easy.
Coming out of the fantastic legal needs report that CSI prepared, it was a really great opportunity for us at Circle Green Community Legal to reflect on our practices, to confirm the paths that we already knew, and to take those recommendations and see what we could be doing better. So we wanted to have a bit of a look through those recommendations, just been summarised, and talk about how in practice that's been translating at Circle Green now and moving forward.
Yeah, so some maybe leave for the end. What was nice and reaffirming is that some of the recommendations we already have under our belts and have been doing. So I'll leave that for Maddie to talk about. But some of the work we've been doing in terms of responding to the recommendations include, so we like to think that we're trauma informed, but this was really a good opportunity to make sure that we are kind of living and breathing that. So making sure we're getting all our staff are getting trauma informed training so that we can ensure that every touch point we're in building an informed trauma response. Also, in terms of one of the recommendations was around having publications available in different languages, so we're doing some work on that as well. We've been doing a lot of relationship building with other organizations in terms of promoting our referral pathways and encouraging warm referrals into our organization. So making sure that we're able to collaborate and coordinate that kind of quasi almost case management approach to making sure that we're having a holistic response. On our website, we have all kinds of resources on workplace sexual harassment, legal claims and information. And because there's so many, because the current legal framework is so kind of convoluted and there's so many different pathways, we're designing a specific workplace sexual harassment and discrimination hub. So pulling everything together, but also making it more clear and more accessible for people. And our lived experience advisory panel, which was another one of the things that we know that we're on the right track because we have that already. We're able to provide advice and really valuable information in terms of making sure that that is accessible and that it's really strength-based and can help people that land on that page who are feeling pretty disengaged, disempowered, and unworthy, feel that sort of there's no inappropriate way to feel, that they're in the right place, and that there are supports available, and that it's going to have a clear sort of pathway and be helpful for them. Also, I think one of the, in terms of the barriers we spoke about, in particularly in regional areas, we've been able to do some work towards trying to transcend that issue in terms of making sure we're raising awareness about workplace sexual harassment so that, one, people don't know what it is, so that's a barrier if you don't know what it is, and then helping to make those connections with organizations and communities around knowing that the supports are available and different pathways available to sort of reduce the barriers to help seeking behavior. And we also recently changed our legal database that was slightly ancient, not really that ancient, but just not contemporary. And so we're really hoping to be able to better, I suppose, grapple with our data and also express it in a more helpful way. And I thought, Maddie, that you could talk, one of the recommendations was around making sure that clients have like accessible language and understanding about their rights and options, which is something that we can also take as something that we do well. We could talk about.
Yeah, so I guess in terms of the key takeaways from the recommendations from the report, from my perspective in my role at Circle Green, which is focused on advice and assistance to clients, so legal advice and assistance focused. A couple of the really big takeaways I took were that our processes and approach need to be trauma-informed and person-centric, which, as Heidi said, I think we're really good at. Also that our advice and assistance needs to be practical and acknowledge the challenges within the system that we work in. So at Circle Green, we are advising people who are particularly vulnerable and the nature of, or disadvantaged. The nature of this type of conduct is that it's intersectional. So as was highlighted, often those targeted with this type of conduct will also be experiencing other things in their life, such as family domestic violence. There's a high proportion of our clients who have disabilities or other vulnerability criteria. So at Circle Green, we do take a person-centric approach, but it was really nice to confirm that the practicality of our advice is what those target cohorts need. So when we're advising our clients about their options, we give them legal advice, we also give them practical advice about navigating the systems and processes that are in place. And we'll continue doing that as that seems to be a great area of legal need that was identified in the report, which lines up with the feedback from our clients.
Sorry, what was it?
No, go ahead.
So then another bucket of the recommendations was to workplaces and employees. And if you think back to the report that Leanne mentioned at the beginning, one of the big point of that report is that our current system is not fit for purpose. And if you are experiencing workplace sexual harassment, you really have to stick your neck out, and the onus is on you to report it. And then once you do that, your employer might be held vicariously liable. But in terms of the necessary reframe that we're sort of gearing up towards is really to put the onus on organizations and businesses to have a proactive, preventative approach to workplace sexual harassment as a behavior, as well as related behaviors such as sex discrimination, etc. And so there is now a positive obligation on organizations and businesses to have effectively a response and prevention plan in these kind of 7 areas. In case you can't see them, they're measuring, leadership, risk assessment and transparency, culture, knowledge, support, and reporting. And so really, if you are a business or organization, there are so many practical tools now to support you to do this, which is located in the Respect at Work portal, respectatwork.gov.au is the URL for that. And so there's heaps of practical tools in terms of being able to support businesses and organizations to comply with that obligation, but also if you are someone who's being targeted by workplace sexual harassment, there's also heaps of resources to support you to make decisions around how to respond, and if you haven't been targeted, even to learn more about it in a general sense. So that kind of is a really helpful implementation tool to address some of the recommendations that have come out of this report. Did you want to add anything to that?
No, just to say that we'll be moving on to, I think, law reform next. And in terms of the positive duty that's been introduced into legislation now, that was a key piece of law reform that Circle Green was strongly advocating for. So really happy to see that go through and be prioritised by the new government. We also, obviously, as part of the recommendations from the report, there are quite a few areas identified in terms of law reform, which are areas of focus for us. We have a team who works on law reform at Circle Green, and some of the key things they're focusing on at the moment that were part of the recommendations were the use of non-disclosure agreements in workplace sexual harassment matters, which is confidentiality or gagging clauses for those who aren't in the know, which have been historically used as a means to silence victims or those targeted by workplace sexual harassment, and in some circumstances to perpetuate a culture where that's allowed to happen again. So that's a big piece of law reform that we're working on at the moment. Another area that was highlighted in the recommendations was the costs, the cost provisions in workplace sexual harassment legal claims. So as it stands at the moment, our Commonwealth piece of law, the Sex Discrimination Act, if you go through to the court stage of that claim, you as a complainant bear a risk that if you lose, or you don't win, you have to pay some or all of the other side's legal costs, which by the time you've got to a court are easily $20,000, $30,000. So we're doing a lot of work in that space as well to make those provisions neutral, so as to not disincentivise claimants from proceeding. So there's always a lot of work to do, and good to hear from the report and the recommendations that those areas of need for law reform are the ones that we're working on. And of course, as with all legislation, I guess in such a particularly complex and interesting area, there's a lot of potential to test case about holes in the scheme that we're looking at the moment without spilling any details.
And maybe just the difficult, like the benefit of a test case is that it sets a precedent that you can then use moving forward. But the difficulty is that it's really hard to find clients that actually want to bring their matter forward because of just like how long it takes and the extra trauma that's going to be involved. And I think we're saying most people would rather just settle.
Yeah, to give you some context, that's absolutely right, Heidi. In terms of going through a process to get to the stage where you're filing in court, so you go usually to a commission first, and then if it's not settled, you go to a court. Usually takes at least 18 months In the federal system, you're waiting around for 9 to 12 months. So you can imagine someone who's already been through a very traumatic experience, perhaps can't return to work, financial hardship, having to kind of stick it out and keep sticking it out for that period. So we're always on the lookout, but because we are person and client centric, it's not always in the client's best interest to keep pushing through.
That's pretty much everything. Does anyone have any questions?
Just curious about, I've got two sons, one's 23, the other one's 30. You had a number there, 13% were males that were in stats. In terms of, and I know my boys, I brought them up, they're pretty soft. And I work in the space for the last 7 years in sexual assault and domestic violence, family violence. I think the narrative now is changing to family violence because I think it needs to, because a lot of men get psychologically abused. They might not get physically. I know in a couple of cases my son has experienced that. So the question is, how do you make it more inclusive of males, young males, balancing the narrative so that they feel safe and comfortable as well, and to be able to come forward and report it in the workplace? Because I think there's a lot of, especially in the mining or other places like that, if a male was to do that, then they just get
I think you're right.
making fun of and, you know, put down for stepping forward, because it's like, okay, if a woman wants to come and, you know.
I think there's
Thanks.
there's so many layers to this. One layer is that we do know that gender inequality is like a driving factor, but it's not the only factor, as you're saying, and so it is broader than just women being the people targeted by what harassment. And there are, because of, I suppose, often framing that sort of prioritizes women, which we do need to do as in terms of like statistically being able to respond to that. It does and can act as a barrier to like being inclusive to all people. I think in terms of our particular context, we aren't like a gender specific service, so we don't have that as a signpost that would kind of exclude certain groups from coming to us. So we're lucky to be able to have that in terms of not being a barrier. And sometimes you need that kind of specialist service, that because some women might feel more comfortable going to a gender specific service. So that isn't a barrier for us. We have noticed actually an increase in men coming to our service with workplace sexual harassment matters. So I do think in terms of accessibility and inclusivity, like our stats are looking good in that way.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right in your comments, and we have noticed that we have had more male representation in terms of people seeking advice, and I know we've got two current male clients who target this behaviour. And I think from my perspective, it's about making sure our approach is inclusive and kind of the rising tide will catch.
So when you say that, like, what is that going to look like? Like, you're talking about putting a framework or policies. And the other thing that adds to that is, like, if you've got same couples, like it might be a girl harassing another girl, a man harassing another man. So I was just curious on this stats, on how you're going to do that in actual your framework and your policy. And your processes. What does that look like?
From a client-focused perspective, so talking about the clients that I assist, we've also noticed an increase in people reporting harassment from someone of the same gender identity as them, so female identifying, male identifying. So outside of that kind of stereotypical idea of a male always being the harasser and a young female always being the person targeted.
In terms of your framework question, I think there's also layers to that, and also, I think it's kind of like an ongoing process. So one layer is about making sure that we're consulting broadly and also like leveraging our lived experience advisory panel, which is open to all genders as well. So being able to like have that inform what we do. And then I lost my train of thought, sorry, but that's one piece. And it is really an ongoing conversation, making sure we're consulting with broader groups. And I suppose also another piece is that, that's what I was gonna say, messaging. So making sure that we aren't just, I think general kind of messaging works to a degree, but you don't kind of hit certain groups, so making sure that we're able to tailor messaging for different groups to be able to have that inclusivity in terms of pulling people in.
And are you talking about, for example, with Aboriginal people, like, there's the women prefer to go to women, men prefer to go to men, so incorporating something like that.
Yeah, and that was kind of one of the recommendations that came up in this was around, I forget the exact wording, but it was around having someone from the same culture.
Yeah.
Effectively to be able to support. And like those kind of things, we talk about the framework, like those are things that we can we don't necessarily have the money, the funding at the moment to be able to have someone from every culture to be able to respond to everyone that comes in the door, but sort of being able to consider those things so that we can advocate for like tailored responses that are gonna meet the needs of
And one last question, because you mentioned staff are trauma informed. What about mental health first aid?
Yeah, that's also on a broader organizational, that's on our list of things, so I know that's coming up. But I couldn't necessarily say at the moment that we have that as a, something that we've embedded into our organization holistically, but it's on the list.
Any other questions? I just had a question about the data. Can we follow this pathway through? So you start off with population-based surveys, and that gives you prevalence. And in those surveys, do we get a really accurate idea about the extent to which people are reporting? So we get that. We get the reporting, prevalence reporting. So we then get the next stage, which is that they come to a service. And so are there any gaps along the way? So are we getting a reasonable picture from these bits of data that are now being brought together? It's like a jigsaw puzzle. You get this over here, this here. Are there any real gaps in this, significant gaps in this story?
Well, we also spoke to 1-800-RESPECT, some telephone hotlines. We also spoke with legal aid and some other stakeholders, other organisations involved in the area, Department of Health. So we sort of have representation across the board. We just didn't do legal centres, we did others, but I would always say we always need more data. And I think one of the recommendations was actually the data collection from organisations, which could be seen in the mining reports that came out, that no one was reporting, they reported no sexual harassment, whereas it is happening. So yeah, that data collection.
And it's kind of like, what's the word, cyclical, like that no one's reporting because they don't feel safe enough to report in their workplace. So we need that kind of primary prevention shift to have a cultural shift so that people feel safe to report. So you kind of like, we're not going to see that kind of increase until there's that obligation to actually have the safe culture for people to feel that they can speak up.
Other questions?
Nothing coming through online, so.
It's very unusual. So just on the organisational data then, to what extent are you, I mean, it looked like apart from the lived experience, qualitative work, that the data that is held at the organisational level might be a bit surface and you have some demographics, but you don't necessarily have really deep data. being held at the organisational level, is that right or not?
I think at Circle Green we do, because we are the lead agency for this project and for providing these legal advice services. I think more broadly in the sector, I think the data is quite shallow, as you say, which is an issue that was identified.
I think there's a few things there. One is that the national data standards and data definitions, they have like different kind of employment law categories. You don't necessarily workplace sexual harassment isn't necessarily a category. We have, as an organisation, have created a subcategory so that we can catch that, because we're a specialist workplace legal service, whereas other community legal centres aren't necessarily even assisting in that area, so we wouldn't have tailored it to that extent. And then I think too, there's just, like, we are getting people coming to the door, but there's just not a lot of, there's not a huge amount of people seeking help in the first instance, so there's not a lot of data. We do have data, but there's not a lot.
It's a small proportion of what we know in terms of the people who are
In terms of the prevalence,
this type of behaviour. Yeah, that's a really good point. Our national kind of data repository isn't specifically set up to capture workplace sexual harassment, so we've made tailoring as a centre to pick up that data, but it's definitely an area for improvement broadly.
So nationally there isn't, so just to understand that there is a requirement for all legal entities, if you like, to report into a national body, but and that would go to legal firms as well as.
No, it's to do with our funding, because we're obviously funded from government sources, and we report and are accountable in terms of that funding, so we have to record data.
So specifically for community legal assistance service providers.
Yeah, so private practice, it's not captured. There's no data set.
Yeah, we don't have any data for private practice.
That's interesting in, if you look at a number of social service areas where a very high proportion of services are funded from government, you then get a better picture. So you actually have a minority of services that are privately funded who aren't putting into a national data set, whereas in this case, I can see quite a mixture, and so that would limit the extent to which you get information.
Yeah, it's really interesting in the private practice sphere in terms of legal advice and assistance, because we have quite a lot of strong pro bono partnerships with private law firms who are particularly interested in doing this type of work. And yet once we refer matters to them involving workplace sexual harassment, we can't capture the data from then on. And there are substantial pro bono practices built around this type of work, so that's definitely an area that
and only when you get to the court that you get data. So
yes, and look, only probably 5% of cases will proceed to a point where they're published in some way, shape or form. And in workplace sexual harassment, we have maybe one decision a year, because people can't get there.
And they settle a lot, which means you wouldn't be privy to what the terms are. So
about 95% settle.
Have any stats on that?
Exactly. Yeah. So there's definitely a big pool of data there that they're not tapping into at this stage.
Yeah, good. Other questions?
I'll throw one if I can. Thank you, great presentation, really appreciate it. Very aware of the positive duties that are flowing through, hence I think it's a very contemporary issue that's getting a fair amount of discussion. Probably go off on a slightly different tangent, and one you may and may not be able to answer, but the question I guess I'm turning my mind to is, how do we move to prevention? There's been discussions around non-disclosure agreements and some initiatives there. How do we get to a position where people are calling it out, or that's the way I've best explained it. Any views around the prevention piece, once it's gone into legal litigation sphere, fraught with issues, and you've alluded to some of those. How do we get ahead of that, I guess, and move into prevention mode? I don't know if that's something you've turned your mind to. I know the research probably doesn't inform that your experience, certainly, mate, if I could ask.
Yeah, that's a great question because I realized I forgot to mention something. So with that, so this includes prevention as well. So there is kind of baked in, and the whole way we're trying to shift is to be more in a preventative space if we can. And so some of the things we're doing in that space is we've developed a workplace sexual harassment and active bystander training. So that is really, it's kind of early intervention, but there's definitely a prevention element in it. We as a country have a national primary prevention strategy. So if you are interested in Googling it, the organization is called Our Watch, and that's our national primary prevention for prevention in terms of violence against women foundation. And so being able to, so they've got a really high level theory of change and evaluation framework that we would kind of like any service or program that's trying to contribute to this work kind of fits into, so that we can ensure that we have, because we know from the evidence that there's different settings which are ideal for primary prevention, workplace being one of them. And this Respect at Work report actually drew a lot of the evidence from that has been collected by Our Watch. And so each of the different settings kind of need to be mutually reinforcing so that we can work toward this sort of overall goal of preventing violence against women. And it is intersectional as well, so it's not just women in that sense, but recognizing the different drivers of the gender is a huge one. And then we also are developing effectively a positive duty training. We'll think of a better name than that, but that's really around helping organizations to explore these areas and come up with their prevention and response plan, and acknowledging like how that encouraging organizations to do that is really gonna move the needle in terms of contributing to primary prevention in that area.
Yeah, it's definitely a cultural issue, so there's kind of not one thing we can do, but I think what was clearly identified in these Australian Human Rights Commission guidelines around positive duty was the power of employers in this context that we're talking about to enact and monitor that cultural change, and then also, of course, individual change in terms of bystander responsibility. If you see something, this is how you can respond.
And just on that, obviously in the mining area, there was a huge kind of, well, there are many really awful cases, and it got into the public arena, and the mining companies, from the look of it from the outside, did a number of things. Is that a case study of good, effective work that the mining companies did, and in terms of changing the culture within those organisations? Did they actually do it? I get the impression from little bits of the West Australian, yes, they recognised their duties and went off and did a whole part of work. Did they end up doing that? And has that
Probably too early to tell.
I think it's a long game,
answer.
yeah. The cultural change piece, it's far more economic, but it takes a long time.
Yeah.
And so like, I think a lot of the things we're seeing are really good first steps. But yeah, it will take a while to really know.
Yeah. Well, we have to finish here at 1:45 with the next class coming in, but that was an excellent presentation, so I'd like everyone to